This video is brought to you by Newsreels, the smartest news app on the market, but more about that a little later on. For now, pay attention to this statement, Declaration of Intent.
China, our great neighbor, will help Afghanistan forge peace. Taliban. China, our great neighboring country, can play a constructive and positive role in the reconstruction of Afghanistan and also in the economic development and prosperity of the Afghan people. Suhail Shaheen, spokesman for the Taliban in the Dhaka office.
On the 7th of October 2001, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom and began the invasion of Afghanistan. It started a war that did not end until the 31st of August 2021, almost 20 years later, with the Taliban ultimately regaining power. Despite almost 2 decades of controlling the country and having invested billions of dollars, the United States was unable to establish an autonomous, effective, and lasting Afghan state. This is something we all saw when the country fell to the Taliban after the withdrawal of US troops. Suddenly, every news agency in the world is covering this story, and it can seem like each one has a different interpretation of what is happening now, which only seems to fuel the polarizing effect of US government decisions. And that's where today's sponsor comes in. Newsreels is the smartest news app on the market because it makes it easy to access news from different sources, something that we try to do regularly in our research to get a feel for the bigger picture in the topics we cover. You can quickly get your dose of daily news by simply scrolling through the Reels page like you would on TikTok or Instagram. Reading the news in bullet points and watching Newsreels will help keep you updated on things that matter. I personally love it because it just saves me so much time. Newsreels allows you to absorb a lot of information quickly so you can always be up to date. They chop the clutter to save you time. Okay, back to our coverage of Afghanistan. In the 2 previous videos here on VisualPolitik, which I'll link for you in the description, we told you the key factors that explain the rapid collapse of the Afghan army and the seizure of power by the Taliban, but there were still some crucial questions left unanswered. What went wrong? Despite having 20 years, why was the United States unable to build a strong state, an effective political apparatus? And what does the future now hold for the country? Who do the Taliban trust? And perhaps the most important question of all for many, what exactly is going on with China? What role will it play in the construction of this new Afghanistan? Listen up.
A state of cardboard and stone.
For years, the United States tried to implement and develop a democratic state model in Afghanistan that would allow the country to modernize. A state with its own constitution, legislative bodies, modern armed forces, independent courts, and so on and so forth. And the truth is that during the 2 decades of US control, many advances were made, and in general, the standard of living of the Afghans improved considerably. For example, healthcare and education were extended throughout the country. 8 million more children are in school today than in 2001. The proportion of young people enrolled in secondary education rose from 12% to more than 55%, and Afghanistan had the most rapid reduction in child mortality of all low-income countries, according to the World Bank. And of course, the situation of women in society has substantially improved. The problem is that basically everything depended on the huge checkbook of the US taxpayer, who was basically paying for the whole party. And in fact, things started to go alright in 2014 as North American funds began to dry up. When it came down to it, Afghans did not feel represented by the state. Economic development was scarce, and the credibility of institutions was conspicuous by its absence. To make matters worse, since 2015, the economy has practically stalled. But, in many ways, we already knew this. If one thing has become clear, it is that the Afghan state and the political economic model promoted by the United States was anything but functional. The question is, why? Why on earth was the world's great power incapable of putting in place a political model that worked? Well, basically, we can identify 3 key factors. 3 big mistakes made by the United States of America in its Afghan incursion. The first of these has to do with the state model, a suffocating centralism that had nothing to do with the reality of the country. Afghanistan is a country fragmented by tribes, ethnicities, and disparate local communities. Despite this, the United States developed one of the most centralized state models in the world. All power and decision-making was concentrated in the central government in Kabul. And not surprisingly, when the country is so diverse, and Kabul's control over the territory as a whole has been historically shallow, then problems arise. This almost absolute centralism meant that local communities and elites did not feel involved in decision-making, and that the central state distributed resources and made decisions decisions without a good understanding of the various local realities or needs. Accountability was also made more difficult. Since no one was responsible and there were no control mechanisms, no one was willing to get involved in denouncing the work of others, from contractors to doctors who never visited the hospitals. Therefore, the only incentive for the elites and government officials was to line their pockets, and depending on the case, blame the capital or local officials. The fact is that this national model meant that the different communities did not develop ties or links with the government of the Republic, an entity that was alien to them, and which, to top it all off, had been set up by a foreign power. And not only that, this state structure, along with the huge amounts of money that came with the international troops, provoked the second huge mistake: the development of a rentier and terribly corrupt model. That is, professionals, companies, even the military and civil servants, all parties specialised in chasing Uncle Sam's dollars. It was something akin to the well-known curse of natural resources. Only in this case, it was the curse of international aid. Let me explain. Let's say that the best way to make money was not to create real businesses and competitive companies, but to look for ways to tap into and get as much of the international money as possible. And that thinking, that not only slowed development, but also fueled rampant corruption. You start looking for a couple of Uncle Sam's dollars, and end up demanding bribes from drivers to use a road. According to estimates by the United Nations and some foundations, Afghans paid bribes to public officials, including the police themselves, totaling more than 2.5 billion every year. And of course, this explains why, in 2020, 2/3 of Afghans considered corruption to be on the rise and one of the most serious problems in the country. Indeed, for many years, corruption was perceived by Afghans as a bigger problem than the lack of security itself.
People consistently told me the Taliban regime was authoritarian in ways that they detested, but that it was not corrupt. Sarah Chase, former advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the US military.
Evidently, this situation had two direct consequences. On the one hand, the state was not effective in fulfilling its tasks, and on the other, Afghans did not trust it, and as a result, were not willing to risk their lives defending it. But wait a minute, because we're not done yet. Together with the centralism imposed by the United States and the permissiveness of the rentier corrupt states of Karzai, Ghani, and company, we can find a third glaring error: lack of non-military vision. This is something we have already commented on in a past video, and also in our exclusive newsletter for all of you who support us on Patreon. According to estimates by the Watson Institute at Brown University, the United States has spent about $2.3 trillion to date in the Afghan campaign. That's trillions with a capital T. Well, do you know what percentage of this huge amount of money has been allocated to policies and plans to boost development? That is, to things like infrastructure, agricultural equipment, financing for entrepreneurs, digital connectivity, or education, among many other possibilities. Well, hold on to your chair, because you're gonna need it. Less than 1% of total spending, that's less than $23 billion. And maybe not even that, because out of that budget, many programs that had nothing to do with development were paid for. How do you hope to support a country's development if you spend less than 1% of your resources on the economy, business, and infrastructure, and concentrate all of your spending on military operations, troop deployments, and counter-narcotics? You can't, and that's exactly what happened. More than $2 trillion later, the Afghan government has dissolved like a sugar cube, and the country remains one of the poorest in the world, and life expectancy is a mere 63 years. A complete disaster. But wait a minute, because there is something in this whole story that explains this debacle that is now unfolding. Look at this graph. What you see represents, with all possible nuances, the evolution of the GDP per capita in purchasing power parity in Afghanistan. At least, that of legal activities. Well, as you can see, around 2014, the growth disappeared. And exactly the same thing happened with per capita imports, which began to fall. And take note, because in a country that produces limited food and basic goods and has to buy them abroad, this means worse living conditions and much more social discontent. And you know what? This evolution was not accidental. Between 2011 and 2015, US spending in Afghanistan fell by more than 50%. And of course, with an inoperative economy plagued by corruption and focused on squeezing international aid, well, when the economy stopped growing and aid began to shrink, then everything began to take a nosedive. And you see, it is something relatively well documented. For example, according to some studies by the University of Oslo and also by the London School of Economics, low economic growth, not the level of income, but low economic growth, the lack of prosperity favours revolutionary or insurgent processes, even more so in Muslim countries that are not entirely free or poor democracies. So yes, they landed that target right in the middle of the bullseye. In other words, when prosperity began to dwindle in 2014 and per capita economic growth even entered negative territory, it created the perfect opportunity for the Taliban to gain followers and social support across the country. And set against the backdrop of rampant corruption and the lack of a sense of representation from the central government, the stage was soon set for the current debacle. And in this case, I think the facts speak for themselves. But at this point, I think it's time to look ahead. What does the future look like for Afghanistan? What challenges do the Taliban face? And the most important question of all, will this country become a kind of Chinese colony? Well, listen up.
The Taliban economy.
The Taliban have won, but now they face the hardest challenge of all. Afghanistan has been in crisis for several years now. More than 3 out of 4 Afghans are mired in poverty, and the impact of the coronavirus and a severe drought prompted the UN World Food Programme to warn that more than 14 million Afghans were facing food insecurity even before the fall of the US-backed government. And you know what? This is a crisis that the Taliban now have to deal with. At the same time, the country is losing the international donations that previously financed more than 70% of public spending. And that's not to mention the huge exodus of human capital that is being experienced, or the impact that their unhinged policies is having. Do you want an example? Then take a look. In recent years, the media industry has been one of the most thriving. According to the figures of the former pre-Taliban governments, we are talking about almost 250 television stations, more than 400 radio stations, and more than 1,500 print media outlets. Now, everything is changing. Although the Taliban have promised freedom of the press, as long as it complies with Islamic law, journalists are being persecuted, television reporters have been flogged in public, and the work of women in the media has begun to be restricted. Of course, no one is throwing any money at the survival of one of the country's most thriving industries. Don't even think that this is an isolated case, so things are obviously not looking good at all. To give you an idea, according to IMF data, the country needs more than $5 billion of external financing every year to keep things from collapsing. And the question now is, who on earth is going to lend that money to a country led by a religious extremist group? In the same vein, many experts point out that Afghanistan faces a high risk of hyperinflation, a sharp drop in per capita income, and serious problems in financing even the most basic public services. All this is something that could fuel opposition movements to the Taliban themselves, or even feed more radical organizations, such as ISIS-K, the sweet and sour. Given such a context, the question we can now ask ourselves is, what do the Taliban depend on? Well, it seems mining has a lot to answer for here. You see, ending the era of oil, gas, and coal requires an energy transition that depends on some key minerals such as copper, lithium, or rare earths, among others. Minerals that Afghanistan could have in large quantities. For example, in May 2021, the International Energy Agency published a forecast that lithium demand could multiply by as much as 40 times in the next 20 to 30 years. And guess what? A Pentagon report cited in the New York Times suggested that Afghanistan, thanks to its huge reserves of this mineral, could become a kind of Saudi Arabia of lithium. What's more, a report by the Afghan government itself pointed out that the country's copper reserves could approach 60 million tons, which would put the country in the top 5 of copper reserves worldwide. But let's put the brakes on for a second. It is one thing to have mineral reserves and quite another to be able to exploit them.
Realized mining requires more than geological abundance. It also requires security, infrastructure, energy resources, water resources, and a skilled workforce. Rod Schoonover, head of the US Strategic Risk Council's Ecological Security Program. In mining, it can take 10 or 20 years from the discovery of a deposit to its exploitation. No company will want to invest if there is no stable political and legal framework. Guillaume Pitron, Tong, author of the book The Rare Metals War.
At the end of the day, Afghanistan has nowhere near the infrastructure necessary for large-scale mining. At best, it would take many years to set up and would require a huge investment. Exactly the same thing happens with a pipeline project like the TAPI that we have already covered in our first video of this trilogy on Afghanistan. What is needed is stability, legal certainty, knowledge, and lots of money. And it is right here, precisely here, that all eyes are on China. Listen up.
China's latest colony.
Do you remember this news story?
China, our great neighbor, will help Afghanistan forge peace. Taliban.
It seems clear to the Taliban, China has the capital, the technology, and the appetite for minerals and business that their theocratic emirate needs in order to get ahead. And in a way, it is not unusual. China has been the largest foreign investor in Afghanistan since 2010, and in 2007, the China Metallurgical Group Corporation took a $3 billion lease on a copper mine in Mezanyak. China has been the largest foreign investor in Afghanistan since 2010, and in 2007, the China Metallurgical Group Corporation took a $3 billion lease on a copper mine in Mezanyak, a region 26 miles or 40 kilometers south of Kabul, the largest foreign investment in the country's history. For its part, the China National Petroleum Corporation won a tender in 2011 to drill 3 oil fields in the Amu Darya River Basin for 25 years. In other words, Chinese interest in Afghan resources exists and has a long history. Now, with the withdrawal of the United States, the path seems clear for Beijing to become the most influential player in the country. Think about it for a moment. The Taliban need money, investment, and perhaps even political protection. In response, China has money, experience in investing in high-risk countries, a veto in the United Nations Security Council, and is dead set on getting its hands on the raw materials it needs in the technological war with the United States. Besides, democracy or human rights? Well, let's just say that those things are not too high on their agenda. In other words, they look like two partners doomed to come together. In fact, even before the takeover of Kabul, the Taliban had already promised to protect Chinese investments in Afghanistan. However, not everything is as straightforward as it seems.
Do you think Afghanistan will develop peacefully and steadily from now on? Do you think Afghanistan has unlimited business opportunities right away? Do you think Afghanistan is extremely important for the new Silk Road? Do you think wake up, mates in ya, researcher at the Ministry of Commerce of the People's Republic of China?
Taking advantage of resources in Afghanistan involves huge investments and a very long-term vision. And not only that, it also requires stability in the country once and for all. A country that, let's not forget, has been at war for 40 years. The Chinese government is aware that it now has the upper hand. The departure of the United States from Afghanistan makes China an indispensable player for the country, especially, of course, for the Taliban. However, on the other hand, many Chinese analysts are also warning against getting too deep into the hornet's nest from which no one will emerge unscathed. Chinese companies that have invested in Afghanistan have seen their projects languish for years due to corruption and a lack of both security and basic infrastructure. There is also the example of India, which, after having invested more than $3 billion in the country, is now out of the game thanks to the arrival of the Taliban. Afghanistan is like that, unpredictable and uncontrollable. And then, let's not forget, this country, Afghanistan, is going to be a hotspot for jihadist groups like the ISIS-K, or East Turkestan Islamic Movement, a group of Uyghur militants who dream of creating an Islamic caliphate in an area that would include Chinese territory. Will the Taliban be able to stop these jihadist groups? It is not clear that they will be able to, or that they would even want to. Anyway, as you can see, the stage appears to be set for Afghanistan to become a kind of lackey country of the Asian giant. But be careful, because nothing is set in stone. At the moment, the future of Afghanistan looks bleak, very bleak. But having come this far, it's your turn. Do you think China will eventually take control of Afghanistan? Leave your comments below. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button. All the best, and see you next time.